I had posted a question a couple of days ago asking if there were to be a Techter guide, written or in video format, what things would you all want to know? And of course, the answer was everything. With that said, one topic that was always asked was elemental downs. So of course, by proxy, we're also going to talk about physical downs today. Yes, as Techter, wand users, both element and physical downs are important to understand, as wand does both across all of its attacks. So while this video isn't Techter specific per se, I do believe understanding the basic mechanisms of this game is important to understanding Techter as a whole. You can find timestamps in the description below. As you see on the screen, we're going to be covering the following. What are elemental and physical downs? What triggers a down state? Down thresholds, scaling, and modifiers. How do they vary based on tech classes, specifically Techter, Force, and Bouncer? And weapon differences. There are a lot of different ways to discuss the topic of downs, and we could literally spend an hour going through all the specific details. Of course, that would be torture. So instead, I'm going to refer to verified data tables that you will also be able to find in the description below for your own reference. What are elemental and physical downs? Simply put, downs are stun states. In the current state of the game, they prevent the enemy from moving or attacking for a designated period of time. As you can imagine, physical downs are triggered by physical damage, while elemental downs are triggered by elemental damage. In the current state of the game, elemental downs are triggered by the enemy's, usually boss, but there are other exceptions, corresponding elemental weakness. Outside of some duration differences, there appears to be no real difference between these down states. So whether you've burned the boss or frozen the boss, essentially it's a stun state that just has the animation that corresponds to that element. It is important to understand what is treated as physical, and that is any weapon-based attack that does not provide any sort of element damage. For example, sword attacks, rifle attacks, and even rod, talus, and wand normal attacks. I want to call this out because while these are tech weapons, their basic attacks are physical, ignoring things like elemental weapons, which we'll get into later. Elemental damage comes from things like techniques, wand explosions that are elementally based, jet boot explosions that of course are elementally based, and elemental weapons. What triggers a down state? After doing a certain amount of down damage, also referred to as down accumulation to an enemy, a certain threshold will be met, resulting in the boss being stunned for some duration of time, which can vary. Of course, that stun is going to either be the elemental down or the physical down. There is a key difference between physical and elemental downs. For elemental downs, no matter where you attack, elemental down accumulation will occur. This is not always the case for physical downs that require you to target specific body parts of the enemy. For example, Daedal, or the Daedal type enemy, as there are various types of Daedals now, can only be physically downed while targeting the legs. While the legs, the chest core, and the back core will all build elemental down accumulation. In the next section, we will discuss the properties of core or weak spot damage and its interaction with down states. And there's some implications and some consequences of that we'll also discuss. Now, these down accumulation values are determined based on values that are designed within each weapon. So they're innate to the weapon. It isn't like some kind of random thing. A weapon and an attack does a certain amount of down accumulation. And that can be normal attacks. That can be photon arts, and of course, techniques such as Fourier, Zondi, so on and so forth. So let's take a look at some of these values. Once again, this data can be found in the description section below. Specifically, let's look at wand data just to keep things simple. So this is what we call the PSO2NGS attack table. So when you see it in the description, it's going to be this link. What you're going to see here is the different attack names. Step attack, step counter. Line force, this is essentially wand levers. If you were to do a step attack or a step counter doing wand levers, so on and so forth, working your way all the way down through the photon arts. the photonic furies, or the wand element explosions, and photon blasts. Now, I don't want to go through this too much because it's fairly self-explanatory, but what we want to focus on is this down accumulation section. So as you see, for a step attack, it is going to do 35 physical down accumulation. Step counter, 85. These also create a normal photonic fury. The step counter does a strong photonic fury. Now, what does that mean? Well, when we look at photonic furies, they themselves also do element or physical accumulation. Non-element photonic fury, 15 for normal, 30 for strong. If you're having element, like you've charged Bardo, that photonic fury is going to have 30 element down. The strong is going to have 45. Now you might be asking yourself, well, what's going on with the step attack when it has an element of 6.2? This is in the case where you have an elemental weapon, such as a fire wand or an ice wand, so on and so forth. What that means is that in addition to doing 35 physical, you're also going to be doing 6.2 element. Now, if you have a normal wand, such as the current sequin weapons, the relics, the Grey Gust, basically anything that isn't an elemental weapon, this column, other than photonic furies, can be ignored. As you see with our photon arts, Swift Smash, or even Wave Crash, they too provide physical states. Once again, you will not get the element for these photon arts unless you have an elemental weapon, but you will still, of course, get the photonic fury, as our photon arts do proc photonic furies. One of the things I want to call out is the wand photon blast. And as you see, it does both 270, well, it's a little bit more. It does 60 plus times 6 plus 270, but that's for both element and physical. So the photon blast does not matter if you have an elemental weapon or not. It just so happens to do both element and physical. That is important because this is, and I might be incorrect, but the only, if not one of the only photon blasts that does both. You know, if we look at Talus, for example, looking at its photon blast, it does a little bit of physical, but really it's doing mostly elemental. And the same thing with Rod. So as you can see, the game has values for down accumulation. What we're going to get into is how does that interact with the boss? How does that all culminate into a down? So let's get into down thresholds, down scaling, and down modifiers. To start, we understand the basic concept of the down now. We now understand how our attacks trigger downs or add to that down accumulation, and the importance of targeting the correct part of a boss, and of course, in some cases, some non-enemies. Now, what determines a down threshold for a particular enemy? We're going to refer to the bestiary data, but essentially it is their HP, as down thresholds are some percentage of the boss's health. So looking at the bestiary data, we can see that, in this case of Ard Bancer, it's got a base HP, so let's say if it's level 1, of 11,200 health. Its elemental down is a percentage of that, specifically 10% at 1,120. Moving down, let's look at Bujin. Now, the reason why I wanted to call Bujin out is because it can be physically and elementally down. Ard Bancers just have the element, which leaves out physical. But once again, base health, level 1, 12,000. What do we see with elemental downs? 10%, 1,200. Now, physical down is a little higher at 2,500. Now, what you also see is some multiplier numbers going on here. What this is respective of is after you've triggered that first down, whether physical or elemental, so let's say, hey, I've got 2,500 down accumulation for physical or 1,200 for elemental. The next time you are going to down Bujin is after you do this down threshold in addition to 75%. So basically it's scaling 75%. So if we were to do some quick math, 1,200 times 1.75, increasing it by 75%, you are now going to get 2,100. So every time you down an enemy, its threshold increases. For physical thresholds, it's only going to increase 5%. For elemental downs, it's going to increase 75%. There are other ways that an enemy can scale. Once again, we're looking at base HP of 12,000, and that's level 1. Well, let's look at some enemy-based stats, which is also in this data table. At level 1, its HP is, and it's interesting, I'm not too sure how to read this, but 1.1. So does that mean that its HP is actually 12,000 or is it 110%? But doesn't matter. That's a level 1 Bujin. Imagine that you fought Bujin at the current max level, which is 45. Bujin's health is going to increase 3.8x roughly. So 12,000 times 3.8x, which means its down threshold for both physical and elemental is also going to increase by that amount. This is important because I know elemental downs and physical downs are very powerful right now, even at level 45, but that can all change because if we look at the data tables, now of course this could change in June and it's going to always change, how Sega decides to adjust or manipulate the numbers. But if we look at 45 to 64, we're looking at a health scaling from 3.8 to 11.3. which means you're also going to be naturally scaling the enemy down threshold by this amount. Of course, it's a percentage of their max HP. HP and down thresholds are tied together. There's a relationship. Speaking of bosses, I should note that these values are not necessarily consistent between the same boss type. And what I mean by that is you will encounter Bujin in multiple areas. Quests can and do change these values. They change how much health they have, but they also can change the relationship between health and down threshold. So it's not necessarily always the case that Bujin, regardless of the quest, whether that's going to be open world, cocoon, purple trigger, or pyramid, even though I know that Bujin is technically different, it's not necessarily always going to be 10% of their health equals their element down threshold to start. The quest itself can adjust some things, and that's, it's really not a big consequence. It is what it is, but it's just something to be aware of. Now, you might be asking, why is there such a big scaling difference between physical and element downs? Well, we know one issue is the fact that physical downs in some cases just start higher, but they're also a little bit more restrictive. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at Daedal. Specifically, Daedal Sword. As you can see, 20,000 health to start, physical down 2,500, but it can only be triggered by the legs. While elemental down can be triggered by not only the legs, as we talked about, but the chest and the back core. Well, there becomes a tricky thing when we start looking at cores or weak spots. Specifically, they modify not only the damage they do, but also down accumulation. And this can be triggered by targeting weak points or creating a weak point through things such as blight rounds or weak bullet. So, like potency, down accumulation interacts with these multipliers. For example, if you do 100 damage normally and you target a weak point, you'll be doing 150 damage or 150%. Usually weak points are, additional 50% damage. The same rules apply to down accumulation. So taking Daedal as our example, once again, you can only trigger physical downs by attacking the legs. Without weak bullet, your down accumulation is only going to be 100%. Versus elemental downs, which can target the chest, core, or the back core, effectively increasing your rate 150%. As you can see, the accessibility of elemental downs is being taken into consideration when it comes to scaling. This is important for Techter specifically because we don't necessarily have the tools to say a force that can consistently apply element down to a target weak spot, thus increasing the rate of 150% pretty much the entire time. So we need to consider of using both physical and element downs to our advantages, because we don't want to just focus on elemental downs and become outscaled, because then it's going to take longer and longer and longer when we have the ability to force a physical down. Of course, this comes down to what am I targeting, when, and where. And so speaking of classes, how do down accumulation vary based on classes, specifically Techter, force, and bouncer. If we ignore class skills, they don't. What they differ on is the weapon, which we've already discussed, and the innate down values that are built into that weapon. And then, of course, we have to consider things like class skills. Granted, weapons are important because of things such as reach and distance that greatly impacts how you can apply a down through targeting. While force doesn't have any down accumulation skills, really force is just all damage, when you look at their weapon, they're down accumulation monsters because they can target weak points from any distance with extreme prejudice. You look at Rod, they have great casting efficiencies, and they have elemental bullet, which also has a elemental down value. And you can imagine they can target a weak spot standing in roughly any position and hit that target without much worry of missing it or not being optimal. So that's something to consider. But now, if we look at the class skill trees, we see that Techter through Shifta does have a down factor skill, specifically Shifta Effect Amplifier. Now, what does this do? It increases for both you and your party, if you're in a party, your down accumulation by 5%. So let's say that you do an attack that does either 100 physical or 100 elemental. You are now going to be doing 105%. This is no different to Bouncer's Defeat Amplifier, where for main class, you'll do 20% enhanced or additional physical and elemental down, and subclass 10%. So instead of 100, it's now 120 or 110, depending on whether it's main class or subclass accumulation. Of course, as Tech or Bouncer, you would multiply the 5% by the 10% if Bouncer's your subclass. Well, yeah, that's how it only works. And you would effectively get roughly 16%. Now, of course, Bouncer has physical, elemental decline amplifier, increasing its down state even more, but essentially you get the difference of what's going on. Class in of themselves are not different. The weapons and class skills, if you were to apply those class skills, is really what changes the relationship. So for example, if you wanted to beat Techter Force using Rod, you would get the efficiencies of Rod's just precision and accuracy of hitting weak points, keeping your elemental down, if we're focused on elemental downs, up 150%, without any detriment other than the fact that you're going to lose a lot of damage because a lot of Force's power now is baked into main class skills such as Photon Flare or Technique Domination. But that's a video for another day. And this is elemental downs in a nutshell. I hope this video was helpful as we begin to dive into some of the mechanics to help guide your understanding of Techter. And of course, drop any questions you have in the comments below, and I'll catch you all next time.